So I want to introduce Beth Wallace from the National Wildlife Federation. Dave referenced her. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce her by way of introduction, bring up one of the videos that the National Wildlife Federation has put together, focused mostly on Line 6B and the oil spill in 2010 near Kalamazoo. And we thought that this would be a timely thing, even though it's not directly related to the Straits of Mackinac, because it gets at, Dave just talked about, what a spill would look like. This video does a really good job of showing what the aftermath of a spill has on the community. So we want to show this, to kind of get you thinking about that, and then I'll have Beth come up and talk a little bit more about National Wildlife Federation's perspective. So let me do this.
So I just want to mention that that's one of 3 videos that the National Wildlife Federation has released. In fact, we just released one earlier this week. It's a little bit longer in length, about 7 minutes, but it's my favorite, so I hope that you'll check it out.
Yes, and just to add to that, we have a page of resources in the back, and we put links to all 3 of your videos on that. So,
great. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Bill.
So my name is Beth Wallace, and I work with the National Wildlife Federation. I've worked with them for about 10 years now and started focusing on pipelines. Let me know if I'm talking too loud. I have a loud voice. Started working on pipelines immediately following the 2010 spill. I became really involved in that spill because my family's actually from the area, and a lot of my friends and relatives were directly impacted. So I dove into it trying to understand what went wrong and how we can prevent it, which ultimately led to me writing the report that David mentioned, the Sunken Hazard Report on Line 5. So I'm going to move quickly because I know we want to get to Q&A. But I want to touch on several points. Some of my presentation has already been covered, and so I'll move quick, and then let's dive in. So 10 days prior to the 2010 release, Enbridge actually sat before a congressional committee and said that they could detect a leak instantaneously. And the reason why they were before this congressional committee is actually because Line 6B had so many defects along it that they were asking for extensions to repair the defects. And as mentioned earlier, Line 6B, they knew of the defects 5 years prior to the release, but what they didn't anticipate was that those 5 cracks that they knew about would fuse into one and create this 6-foot gash in the pipeline. This was the largest and most costly, one of the most largely and most costly inland oil spills in U.S. history. Enbridge claims that they spilled 840,000 gallons, but the EPA maintains that they have already cleaned up over 1.2 million gallons. And so there's a huge discrepancy. And that became very contentious with us in particular because EPA Clean Water Act fines are based on how much oil is spilled, and when the at-fault party is saying one number and the agency is saying another, there's huge discrepancies. Ultimately, they settled on the 840,000 gallons, but with the natural resource damage assessment, they acknowledged that there was a substantial amount of oil that was recovered beyond that point. This failure was a system of failures. It wasn't just an accident. It was a culture that was completely inept in maintaining a pipeline of this age, of this characteristic. And that's what really got me going on this particular project, is understanding the depth at which they did not properly maintain this pipeline and respond following the release. As mentioned, it was a 17-hour release. Not only did they know that the pipeline, there were alarms going off, the system was telling them something was wrong, they ignored it, they increased pressure. They did not find the spill. It was actually a local Consumers Energy person who discovered the spill and reported it to Enbridge. There were further delays, several hours where Enbridge did not report it to the national reporting system, and so that delayed the federal response. And then the week following, they continued to underplay how much was actually spilled, how they were responding. I remember I showed up, it had to have been close to day 3 at this point because the media didn't get wind of it until day 2. And there were barely any booms, there were barely any people. There was a stake in the ground that said, if you have health concerns, call this number. If you have wildlife concerns, call this number. We tried calling it because we came across wildlife that was frantically trying to clean itself. Nobody answered. Come to find out, that number went directly to Enbridge. They were dispersing the calls to the appropriate agencies that may be responding, or themselves. And it was just complete chaos for the first week. It took them a solid week to set up animal response, and then another solid week to actually get animals into the response. Not only that, but there were people living all along the river who were never formally evacuated. I know several people personally who were at home doing chemotherapy. They were being exposed to benzene 24 hours a day. Not only did they live right on the river, their business was right on the river, and they were never told to leave or formally evacuated. At least that's Enbridge's response and position. Ultimately, there were 150 homes that Enbridge ended up buying out from people that lived along the river because they no longer wanted to live in their homes. Either they felt the homes were too contaminated in several cases, or they thought their property value was completely destroyed. Those homes have just started now to trickle back onto the market. Wildlife, there were over 4,000 animals that were directly impacted by this spill. Most of those were turtles or reptiles. The turtles did fare pretty well, although they found out the hard way that when they were cleaning the turtles, tagging them, and releasing them, they had a homing mechanism that were taking them right back to the same places that were making them get oiled. So they kept seeing the same turtles over and over again. Mammals had a really bad mortality rate, around 50%. They were not as lucky, but if you go on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, they have a good breakdown on how wildlife are directly impacted. Like I said, this got me really interested in pipelines, and I started to look at Line 5. And some of my presentation will cover a lot of what Sean has already covered, and so I'll skim through, and then I made a couple notes on things that I think are relevant and important that have not been covered. But I wanted to go over the Enbridge pipeline mapping system with folks, because while Line 5 is critical and important, it's also important to understand how many people know about Keystone XL debate. So the same time Keystone XL was going on, this pipeline was being proposed, got all the attention in the world, we had the 6B rupture. Following the 6B rupture, Enbridge decided they needed to, as a safety precaution, replace Line 6B. What this meant was that they left the old 30-inch pipeline in its place, and they built a brand new pipeline right next to it that was 36 inches. And why this is relevant is because one of the proposals for Line 5 is a replacement. And people need to understand replacement in industry terms never means replacement. It means building a brand new pipeline in its place. That may not be what they do with the Straits because of its unique situation, but it's important to know for the inland section, we will likely see, if that's what the state moves forward with, all land being taken away from the people that already have right-of-ways, and a huge construction project going on. Not only was Line 6B replaced, but Enbridge also expanded all of these pipelines. They expanded Line 5 in 2012, they expanded several pipelines here, they're expanding pipelines here, they built pipelines down south, so while everybody was paying attention to Keystone XL, that export pipeline, and how horrible it was bringing tar sands down, the same exact thing was happening with Enbridge. And they were allowed to move forward with it because of the safety risk. This should have been a presidential permit. They should have been required to do a lot more to get that expansion pushed through, but because of the safety and the emergency mandate following the spill, they were allowed to replace that pipeline without being noticed at all. Also, Line 5, I want to go back, oops. Line 5, I briefly mentioned it was expanded in 2012. Presidential permits should be put in place when a pipeline changes operation. They changed operation by either 10 or 20% of Line 5 was increased. So that amount of product was pushed through in 2012 over the previous number. They should have been required at that point to get a presidential permit because this has an international border crossing at the St. Clair River. They should have been required to get an international permit, which would have triggered federal comment periods, NEPA would have been triggered, environmental assessments, public comments, you name it. But when we went to DC to lobby the State Department, Keystone XL was at its height. Nobody was really paying attention to Line 5, unfortunately, and they told me, we determine existing pipelines on a case-by-case basis, and we need to hear from senators, and unfortunately, it just happened, and there was no public pressure at that point. Around the same time that we were doing that work, we decided to dive Line 5, and that really got our attention when we started to come across some scary pieces of the pipeline. The coating was obviously covered, you could not see it. We also came across huge mounds of debris that were stacked on top of the pipeline, and then zebra mussels galore, which raised a lot of questions and started to get the state to pay attention to maybe there was a larger risk here. We've already talked a lot about supports, but one thing that we did not discuss, well, you did cover the 280-foot support span, correct? Okay. This is a picture of the holidays that Sean mentioned. So this is the protective coating that has completely peeled away of the pipeline. And what's important about this, and I'm not sure that you mentioned, I apologize if you did, but the easement that's with Enbridge through the state of Michigan requires that Enbridge has these coatings on the pipeline. They have to have a certain number of these coatings, otherwise they're in violation of the easement. So the fact that they're just now revealing that they have holidays, potentially 19 holidays on the pipeline, is a very clear violation of the easement, along with the supports and the spans that continue to go be acknowledged by Enbridge almost yearly at this point. I also want to say that when I started out on this project, and if you've read the Sunken Hazard Report, you know that we went into that not really knowing what was going on, and we wanted to bring awareness to it. And the whole time that we've tried to get information from Enbridge, from the state, from the federal agencies, we've hit roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. It's only when we spend thousands of dollars and go down and dive the pipeline and reveal these things and ask more questions, and we have evidence and we push Enbridge, do they actually reveal issues. And it's not until the state has become involved and forced Enbridge's hand to reveal a lot of the information that they've revealed that the real risk has started to present itself in the last year. So I'm going to skip through this. I apologize. So I was the one who commissioned the 29 spills that we discovered on Line 5. I wanted to, Sean mentioned a couple locations that are really critical. Not only is the Straits portion a high risk, all through these locations, the pipeline comes within a couple miles of any of the Great Lakes. In some of these locations, particularly right here, it's complete wetlands. And why this matters is Line 5 in the Straits of Mackinac, Enbridge touts that it's a much thicker steel, and it's safe, and it's overbuilt. I'd argue maybe some of those points aren't as accurate as they say they are, but what's important to understand about the inland section of Line 5, it's a single 30-inch pipeline that's incredibly thinner, and it's had all kinds of issues that have been tied to it. And some of the incident reports that we've gotten our hands on have showed that some of the seams along the inland section of Line 5 actually have stress corrosion cracking happening. This is the same exact cracking that caused the 2006B rupture. And the fact that they have this is evidence that they may have a system-wide issue with Line 5, and it's not just the Straits portion that we need to be concerned about. We also need to be heavily monitoring what kind of inspections they're doing with the inland section, what kind of issues are they turning up, how are they addressing those issues. We do know from this inspection report and this integrity dig that how they correct this particular issue is they take a sleeve of a pipeline and basically put it over the pipeline and then weld it on versus taking the old pipeline out and replacing it with new. A couple quick things I wanted to mention just in relation to the previous presentations. Line 5 in the Straits of Mackinac, you'll often hear Enbridge claim that it's a seamless pipe. However, that's not accurate. This pipeline, while it doesn't have a horizontal sleeve, seam, when they fold it, there's usually a horizontal seam. It does not have that, but it has seams every 45 feet where they had to weld each section together. And if I remember correctly, it's a couple thousand welds for this pipeline in the Straits crossing. And so when we talk about having supports every 75 feet, that's critical because of all the welds that are in that location. And when you talk about currents oscillating back and forth and stressing that pipeline, think about that span that was 280 feet long that went unsupported for 5 years. They knew about it. It went back and forth with currents for those 5 years at least. And what kind of permanent stress damage did that do to that section of pipeline? To this day, Enbridge claims the worst case scenario is 3-minute shutdown. The risk assessment that was canceled today was evaluating worst case scenario. That's what the task force mandated that be carried out, because worst case scenario is obviously not a 3-minute shutdown. That is the absolute best case scenario, and we all acknowledge that. The state was doing that assessment because they were evaluating what kind of resources Enbridge needs to have in a worst case scenario. And because we no longer have this risk assessment happening, we have nothing for the state to go back to Enbridge and say, you know, the $1 million we required you to have when you built that pipeline, it actually needs to be like $22 billion for you to address a spill in this location. They don't have that document to show them now. And so by the state not having a risk assessment done, we now have still huge questions on what a worst case scenario is in the Straits of Mackinac. And so personally, I think that the state should take immediate action on Line 5 until they rectify this situation. A couple more points. We also talked about worst case scenario, and what Enbridge never talks about, which was referenced earlier, is there's 2 different products that run through Line 5. There's the light gas, or the light crude that runs through, and then the natural gas liquids that runs through. And we learned from a 1999 spill in Crystal Falls that when a leak happens of the natural liquid gas, it creates a plume. It is a gas that is heavier than air, and it creates a plume that does not disperse. When that happens, the only solution that Enbridge really has is to burn it and to get rid of it. So if there is a release in any location of the 2 different products, but in particular, if there's a release at the Straits of Mackinac and both products are released in the same incident, which happened in the Yellowstone spill that happened several years ago, 2 different products were released in the same spill. If that happens, there's a huge risk that nobody's talking about. They cannot really respond if there is a plume of gas hovering over the area. They have to address it. And not only is it a safety risk for the first responders, it's also a safety risk for the public. And so I do hope to interject that into the conversation moving forward. And that is how I will end it. Great.